use either of the two exit doors. People who use the door located next to the public gallery are advised to proceed through the lobby to the front door, down the main staircase to the muster point at James Park. People who use the door located to the presiding officer's left are advised to proceed to the gate leading to Buckner Street Extension and then to the muster point at the Old Market Car Park. At the muster point, further instructions will be given by fire wardens or other authorized officials. Also, please sanitize your hands upon entering and leaving the premises at designated security.
Let us pray. O Almighty God, as we have come together to begin our meeting of the Assembly, we humbly beseech you to grant to all our members the light and guidance of your Holy Spirit, that we may wisely take counsel together and come to such decisions as shall promote your glory and the well-being of our citizens in this land, so that peace and happiness, truth and justice may be enjoyed by all people. Grant this for the sake of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Presiding officer.
Members, I wish to make the following announcements. The presiding officer, Mrs. Vanessa Cotton Thomas, submitted a written resignation to the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, as well as the Deputy Presiding Officer of the Tobago House of Assembly. In accordance with Sections 21A and 22 of the Tobago House of Assembly Act 40 of 1996, I advise formally that a vacancy exists in the membership of the Assembly with effect from the 25th September 2020. Additionally, the Secretary of Community Development, Enterprise Development and Labor has requested leave of absence from the 39th sitting of the Tobago House of Assembly. The leave requested has been granted. Permit me, even in recognition of our celebration of our 44th anniversary as a republic, to extend to you Republic Day greetings, and I trust that your celebrations yesterday, in light of all that is happening with the global pandemic, would have been a reflective one, so that we can enjoy and celebrate the fact that over 40 years of democracy is shining down on us as representatives of this House and of this nation. And so I would wish to wish all of you Republic Day greetings. Thank you.
Assembly bills sent back from Cabinet, Assembly laws brought back from Parliament, petitions, papers.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. This morning I have the privilege of tabling the following papers in this Honorable House. The Tobago House of Assembly's monthly budget report at the end of April 2020, May 2020, June 2020, and July 2020.
To secretaries, questions for oral answer.
Question number 73 to the Chief Secretary and Secretary of Tourism, Culture and Transportation.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. In relation to the Roxborough Police Station, the original estimated completion time was 18 months at a cost of $65 million. In reality, the completion time, it took 29 months to complete that project at a cost of $64.829 million.
Request for leave to move the adjournment of the Assembly on definite matters of urgent public importance. Statements by secretaries or assistant secretaries, personal explanations, introduction of bills, motion relating to the business or sittings of the Assembly and moved by a secretary or assistant secretary. Public business, Executive Council business.
The motion reads as follows. Whereas the coronavirus, COVID-19, has impacted the traditional delivery of education globally. Oh, forgive me. I would wish to call the mover of the motion, Secretary with responsibility for education, innovation,
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, let me take this opportunity on behalf of the Division of Education, Innovation, and Energy, and certainly on behalf of the constituency of Blackrock, Wim, Spring Garden, to which citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, and in particular the people of Tobago, a belated happy 44th anniversary of this country attaining Republican status. As Tobago seeks greater autonomy, with greater demands for greater control over its internal affairs, I reflected on the speech of our first president, Sir Ellis Clark, in his address to the nation at that time, when he said that both nations or both islands must develop side by side and not one behind the other. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, as Secretary of the Division, I led the charge to ensure that in this period of an unprecedented COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic, that our schools were not left behind, indeed, that our students and teachers were not left behind, but were side by side with not just Trinidad and Tobago, but with the majority of the rest of the world. The fact is that our level of preparedness for online learning for the reopening of school on September 1st, 2020 was comparable with the rest of the world. And therefore, at this juncture, I wish to refer to the motion. Whereas the COVID-19 has impacted the traditional delivery of education globally, and whereas the blended approach that involves face-to-face and online teaching is not practical at this time in Trinidad and Tobago, and whereas in Trinidad and Tobago schools cannot physically reopen for the first school term, September 1 to December 17th, 2020, thereby necessitating online instruction as well as the use of packaged materials. And whereas there is a greater need for the involvement of parents and guardians in ensuring that students are able to effectively continue receiving instruction during this new normal, be it resolved that this House supports the initiatives of the Division of Education, Innovation and Energy to provide improved instructional, technical, psychological, and logistical support for students, teachers, and parents, and be it further resolved that this House calls on employers, managers, and supervisors in both the public and private sector to demonstrate a sense of tolerance, understanding, and commitment towards the parents of students who may be in their employ. And be it further resolved that the House implores businesses, civil society organizations, private citizens, and other stakeholders to contribute to the provision of appropriate digital devices for use in our schools, as well as to offer support generally in ensuring that we meet the needs of our students at this time. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, on the 1st of June 2020, as Secretary, I appointed 2 special purpose committees. The first was the Digital Future Committee, with responsibility for planning and executing the digitization of teaching and learning for ECCE primary and secondary schools. This committee was also expected to organize e-learning training for teachers and other stakeholders. In fact, part of its remit was 1, to prepare and submit a plan within 90 days for the digitization of teaching and learning in the schools that I just mentioned. 2, to create a plan for the sensitization and training of all stakeholders in the use of electronic devices. To explore practical infrastructure that is required to allow each student in every community reliable access to digital learning. To discuss and obtain a commitment from internet providers to strengthen Wi-Fi accessibility throughout Tobago. To provide recommendation on training for parents and guardians to empower them to provide support to their children. To gather data on students who own digital devices or who have access to devices in their homes. To provide information on the number of devices needed for effective delivery of digital learning. To provide suggestions for adequate devices for teachers explore the effectiveness of the various platforms and tools that can be utilized by teachers and parents. And this list is not exhaustive, but it represents the key ones that the committee was mandated to treat with. The second committee, the School Reopening Committee, was mandated to ensure that all schools were ready for the start of the school year. And major tasks included, but were not limited to, ensuring that there was adequate physical spaces to accommodate all students, while adhering to the physical distancing protocols as outlined by the Ministry of Health, ensuring the safety and security of all students and staff in keeping with the established health protocols, and preparing our schools for the conduct of national and regional assessments, SCA, CSEC, and CAPE. So, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, given the special circumstances, the unprecedented situation visited upon us by the pandemic, and given what was happening globally, when one looks at those contexts, it is quite clear that we in Tobago were as ready as any, and certainly more ready than many. In fact, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, one of our key stakeholders, the Trinidad and Tobago Unified Teachers Association, has admitted, and one heard its president admit as well, that Tobago was more prepared for online teaching, and I can't say this too loudly, especially in the area of training of parents, than our bigger brother or sister. Other members of the executive of that institution have also expressed the view that Tobago's readiness for engaging students during this period of home-based learning was not behind, but on par, if not ahead, of Trinidad. The high level of readiness was due to the proactive approaches by the division to embark on extensive training of teachers in the use of different platforms and tools for virtual learning. If this sounds too good to be true, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, this time it is true. The first lockdown announced on March 13th, and then all schools were subsequently closed on Monday the 16th. At that time, the readiness of schools for virtual teaching and learning was not there. In fact, teacher-student engagement was minimal and focused mainly on students who were preparing for national and regional assessments. Teachers of Standard 5 classes were able to reach 98% of their students, while at the secondary level, CSEC and CAPE outreach to students was 95%. We highly commend our teachers for their determination, persistence, enthusiasm, and commitment in reaching the majority of their students for these high-stakes exams. Unfortunately, at that time, online engagement with other students was less than 50%. Attempts were made to treat with this by virtue of care packages. And it is important to note as well, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, that all schools were physically prepared to accommodate students for the conduct of assessments at primary and secondary levels. Sinks were installed at each school entrance, sanitization of the buildings and furniture was complete. Security guards were trained in the use of thermal scanners to check the temperatures of all persons entering the compound. Hand sanitizers and paper towels secured in appropriate dispensers were strategically placed, and there were isolation rooms to accommodate students if that became necessary. As a matter of fact, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, it may interest you to know that performance of our students in both the CSEC and CAPE examinations has been quite a stellar one. In respect of our CSEC performance, those who got 5 passes and more, including maths and English, we had 6 out of our 9 secondary schools improving their pass rate. Over the years, the percentage of students acquiring no passes continues to decline. 2017, that stood at 10.7%. 2018, 6.8%. 2019, 6.7%. 2020, 3.6%. May I repeat that, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer? I know you like statistics. I would just say that in 2017, it was 10.7% of our cohort didn't get a single pass. In 2020, we can talk about 3.6% not having a single pass. So we are moving in the right direction. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, as we continue to monitor the situation, one was hopeful that as the infection curve flattened, schools at the ECC and primary levels may have been able to open with face-to-face teaching. In fact, as part of our analysis, 6 schools could have been reopened while observing the physical distance protocols without any major adjustment. These schools were Ebenezer Methodist, Lansford Methodist, Hope Anglican, Palliative Anglican, Blackrock Government, and Scarborough RC. We wanted to level the playing field, however, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, to facilitate face-to-face learning for all ECC and primary school students. And therefore, we communicated with religious organizations, the Methodists, the Anglicans, the RCs, the Seventh-day Adventists, Church of God, and Marinate, and obtained provisional agreements to utilize churches and church annexes in order to accommodate students in respect of adhering to physical distancing. We were also on the verge of looking at our community centers to accommodate those students in close proximity to primary schools when the announcement was made that there would be no in-school or in-class learning and teaching for the first term of the school year. With regards to the secondary schools, a 5-day face-to-face rotation was planned and supplemented with online engagements. The large population at this level could not permit 100% face-to-face while observing the required physical distancing. And the only workable alternative as conceived at the time was the blended approach for our secondary students. This proactive approach by the division, with extensive planning and execution, made Tobago ready for whatever mode of delivery that would have been necessary, whether there was community spread, local spread, or clusters in Tobago. And you see, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, it is necessary to place all of this not only in the context of Trinidad and Tobago, but in a global context. Sometimes we hold the view and perhaps in some cases rightly so, that we are small, we are third world, and that we will always lag behind the rest of the world. But in this pandemic situation, we are on par, side by side with what is happening throughout the world. Permit me to provide a few examples. New Zealand was considered a model, and indeed at the start of the pandemic, not all online learning was accessible to all students in New Zealand. As like anywhere else, providing homeschooling for the younger students has also been a challenge for some parents who are either having to work from home or who were essential workers. They had to go out to work. For these parents, it would have been tough to provide their children the same support as having a teacher in a classroom, no different from the challenge that we are facing and continue to face. The research indicates that some students dropped out of their education due to a lack of motivation and support. It has been quite difficult for youth and their parents and their caregivers to make education a priority at this time. Students from low decile schools in New Zealand lacked a suitable device to access online learning. In a given school in South Auckland, 65% of the students did not have access to a device at home, and even more had no internet at their homes. Canada, considered to have as well a model education system. Many families were unable to provide their children with laptops or other devices. Parents were concerned about dealing with the consistency of having to work and take care of a child at the same time. Few weeks before the reopening of schools, parents, teachers, and school boards grew increasingly frustrated with a lack of details and funding for a safe return to class. Physical constraints, economic considerations, and student needs were all issues. I raise these, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, if only to allow us to recognize that we are not unique and that we are facing some of the same challenges, but we have been moving steadily to treat with all of them. In the United States, Philadelphia is an example. Their Federation of Teachers indicated that they are concerned about returning in person and pointed to a lack of ventilation in school buildings. When the schools were closed in March, many students did not have devices or even the internet, and many teachers had limited experience teaching online. Parents were asked to support their children's remote learning, and still there were many at a disadvantage, depending on their family circumstances and access to private and appropriate learning environments, parents' educational background, and parents' availability to supervise and support their children's learning. Grenada, our closest neighbors. Internet challenges with the switch to online learning. Teachers and students had challenges understanding and using the online platform. New for most persons. They are not comfortable with making the necessary adjustment. All regular classroom teaching could not easily be directed to online. In some communities, students did not have access to a digital device. And for many students, access to the content was a challenge. So, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, what we are facing in Tobago and indeed Trinidad and Tobago is not unique to us. And I know that there are those who would argue or attempt to argue that we may not have done enough. But I thought that I would share some of these evidences so that people will recognize that it has been a most challenging situation. We have been called to the bar, and we have performed creditably. So that for us, we know that there are students who are having difficulty with connectivity. We know that there are students in the minority without electricity. We know that there are students without devices. But may I add that 85% of our teachers are online ready. And I'm saying that because I know what some of the questions will be. In fact, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, things are looking brighter and brighter each day. I can say to you and the Tobago community that as of Wednesday, the 23rd, an assessment of our students' engagement reflects the following, and I shall just give a brief sample. Speyside and Lincoln, and I know the member would be interested in this, because I suspect that he may have done his own survey in that community, given the fact that he lives right there. My information is that 84 out of 94 students have been online, and that packages are needed for only 10 students. Charlottesville SDA, the information I have indicates that there has been 100% student engagement. Roxborough and Lincoln, 142 out of 157 online, and therefore only 15 packages are required. Scarborough Methodist, 659 out of 665 have been engaged online, and therefore only 6 packages are necessary. And Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, there is some more I will just give quickly. Let's take Boko, for example. There has been a total engagement, 225 students. All the students have been reached, 94% online. That equates to 210, and 6% through packages. That translates into 15 packages. Table Peace Government is another one with 100% contact. 85% by virtue of online engagement, and 15% by virtue of packaging. Lance for me, Methodist, 100%. Palliative Anglican, 80% engage online, next 20% package. And those are relatively small schools, so that the numbers in terms of package numbers are not significant. So, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, this is one of the times in the history of our Twin Islands state that we can boast of being sufficiently ready, given what is happening next door, as well as in the rest of the world. You know, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, one of the key elements in this quest for readiness arguably would be the number of teachers who would have been trained. And in July, we partnered with 3 teacher training providers to prepare our teachers from ECC to secondary for online teaching. These providers were Information Technology Professional Development Network, Global, Moodle, and Massive, Global, Moodle, and Massive Open Online Course, referred to as MOOC, to provide training for our teachers. And indeed, training is still ongoing. We expect that the last cohort of our teachers would complete their training by the end of this month. So that in excess of 700 of our 846 teachers have been trained. And as I indicated, training is ongoing as we speak. We also provided training and outreach programs for parents to provide them with the skills necessary to supervise and support their children while they're online. And to date, we have trained approximately 400 parents. Training continues next week because over the last 2 weeks, parents have been busy attempting to adjust to the new normal, as we like to call it, and treating with some of the challenges that they have been experiencing. There are 2 important elements, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, in respect of the concept of readiness for our schools in respect of online teaching, over which we have little control. And one is the availability of a predictable electricity supply and stable internet connections. TNTech, quite unfortunately, has been operationalizing its planned maintenance and upgrade program, and this has caused disruptions while online teaching is in progress. We have held discussions with the management of TNTech, and we have suggested the rescheduling of their maintenance to afternoons instead of mornings. We are hoping that they will take this seriously, because I'm aware of well that the report has been made in Trinidad. One of their concerns, I understand, is that there is a reluctance on their part to pay overtime. How much more time do I have?
You have 10 minutes of speaking time remaining.
So my original time has...
No, 10 minutes of speaking time.
Oh, 10 minutes of speaking time. Thank you, Mr. Presiding Officer, Deputy Presiding Officer. Now, this is the second time I actually said Mr. Presiding. I don't know if it's a slip of the tongue or if something is brewing, but I shall attempt to address you as accurately as I can. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, one of the daily complaints throughout the world, and of course we do have it in Tobago as well, is the issue of either lack of connectivity, low connectivity in some places. In this regard, we have had frequent and robust discussions with the two internet providers in Tobago. B-Mobile claims to have 100% reach throughout Tobago. Digital also boasts of full coverage, but they admit low connectivity in some areas, for example, Castara, Palliative, and Lansford. But of course, we are working with them. In fact, I have instructed our IT to have all the schools upgraded, and that process has begun. Many of the schools are now, I understand, that have an, I think a download speed of 80 megs and an upload of 50. And we're gonna move to 100. So that is supposed to be completed by both providers within a week. So from our standpoint, we are moving to ensure that at least our schools are well equipped with adequate connectivity so that teachers can engage in online teaching. So these upgrades, as I indicated, are expected to be completed by Monday, the 28th of September. And what this means is that teachers who may be having difficulty with connectivity at their homes can in fact deliver their lessons from their schools. Additionally, part of our problem-solving mechanism, we have been able to get both Big Mobile and Digital senior managers to provide their personal contact information, which we have sent to all principals, to allow them to report connectivity problems as they arise, to facilitate early and immediate resolution. As I indicated briefly when I quoted some statistics, those of our students who are unable to access online learning, they are provided with drop-off packages, and we are ensuring that we put in place the infrastructure. In fact, we have repaired, refurbished, or replaced copiers and printers in 90% of our schools. And by next week, any remaining school will be dealt with. In the meantime, teachers are free to attend at our office in Scarborough if they have any challenges in respect of treating with their packaging. Part of our preparation as well involved a pilot testing for online learning, which we did in the first 2 weeks. In the first week, we did a pilot test with 6 primary and 2 ECC centers. And in the other week, all schools were expected to engage in that exercise. And the results were very, very encouraging. The 6 schools were Roxborough Anglican, St. Patrick Anglican, St. Andrews Anglican, Lansford Methodist, Stable Police Government, and Signal Hill Government. In respect of the ECE centers, there were Mount St. George and Mount Grace. This pilot provided data and information that guided the rollout of online teaching for all of our schools. And Teachers provided information because they had to set up email accounts for all students. And they were advised in respect of the conduct of interactions for multiple classes at the same time, how to use instructional materials effectively, how to troubleshoot online disruptions and problems, treating with online etiquette, and to address the concerns and fears of parents. In March, we also took the opportunity to relaunch our website, and that can be found at thadeie.gov.tt. And hence, the learning management system is dedicated to each level, ECC, primary and secondary. On ECC, there are activities relatable to that level, and similarly, primary and secondary system would include worksheets and supplementary content provided by the curriculum unit of the division. The division also launched a YouTube channel to facilitate the provision of e-learning, and videos done by teachers in Tobago at the SCA and CSEC levels would be uploaded onto the website. These videos were also streamed on TTT Channel 5 and Digicel On Demand. And perhaps you could understand why we did well as we did in our CSEC exams. For additional interactivity between teachers and students, the division introduced Moodle for standards 4, 5s, and forms 4 to 6. It is designed to provide educators and learners with a single, robust, secure, and integrated system, as well as to create personalized learning environments. Teachers can provide assignments, quizzes, live streams, lessons, and can grade accordingly. Our website is zero-rated by both Digicel and B-Mobile, and this allows users without internet the ability to still access the website and all of its content. Tobago Education Online Initiative is on the march. The Executive Council has approved the purchase of devices for use in the schools, and that process is going smoothly. But in addition to that, the division is appealing to business organizations throughout Tobago and Trinidad. We are appealing to them to assist in providing devices to our students. And you know, it is going quite well. I have had conversations with a couple of persons, including institutions, and they are prepared to assist. As a matter of fact, I spoke to a gentleman who indicated that his alumni, he went to Scarborough Secondary, would be providing 10 laptops to that school. And I said to him, but you went to a school before you went to Scarborough Secondary. And he said to me, but you know, I didn't even think about that. That school is Mariah Government School. And he called me back and said to me, my wife and I have decided that we will donate 3 devices to that school. I just give that example because people are coming forward. And let me take this opportunity to commend those teachers and PTAs and so on that have taken the initiative either to raise funds or to provide assistance to the schools by way of devices. And in particular, we all heard and read about the teacher from Mason Hall who did that. So as I close, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, let me once again commend all our stakeholders who have risen to the cause, and let me repeat the appeal to our communities, our island, even to our brothers and sisters abroad. This requires a whole of community and a whole of island support. It is indeed an unprecedented situation, and it really calls for unprecedented action and response. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, I beg to move.
Members, whereas the coronavirus, COVID-19, has impacted the traditional delivery of education globally, and whereas the blended approach that involves face-to-face and online teaching is not practical at this time in Trinidad and Tobago, and whereas in Trinidad and Tobago, schools cannot physically reopen for the first school term, September 1st to December 17th, 2020, thereby necessitating online instruction as well as the use of packaged materials. And whereas there is a greater need for the involvement of parents and guardians in ensuring that students are able to effectively continue receiving instruction during this new normal, be it resolved that this House supports the initiatives of the Division of Education, Innovation and Energy to provide improved instructional, technical, psychological, and logistical support for students, teachers, and parents. And be it further resolved that this House calls on employers, managers, and supervisors in both the public and private sectors to demonstrate a sense of tolerance, understanding, and commitment towards the parents of students who may be in their employ. And be it further resolved that this House employs businesses, civil society organizations, private citizens, and other stakeholders to contribute to the provision of appropriate digital devices for their use in schools, as well as to offer support generally in ensuring that we meet the needs of our students at this time. Minority Leader and Member for Roxborough-Delaford.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer. And I want to tell the Secretary for Education thanks for his presentation. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, as I look at the motion, I must admit that it seems to be written by several persons. It seems to be the work of several persons putting this motion together. The motion is disjointed. The motion is impractical. The motion, in other words, is flawed. I wish to point out to you this second whereas, and to juxtaposition that against the final, be it further resolved. The second whereas states, and whereas the blended approach that involves face-to-face and online teaching is not practical at this time in Trinidad and Tobago, hold that, put a hold on that, and put that against, for me, the last or final resolve. And be it further resolved that this House implores businesses, civil society organizations, private citizens, and all other stakeholders, to contribute to the provision of appropriate digital devices for use in our schools, as well as to offer support generally in ensuring that we meet the needs of our students at this time. This House of Assembly is a learned house. It's a house that was created to manage in an autonomous manner the affairs of Tobagonians. Whenever you are given the opportunity to manage people, you must be clear as to what you want and what you are managing. But there is confusion here. We are saying that it is not practical at this time in Tobago to have face-to-face learning. But in the last resolve, we are asking for digital devices for use in school. Not only the motion flawed, but the presentation is flawed and corrupted with high-mindedness. I sat and I listened to my colleague, the Secretary for Education. And time again, he reminds us that teachers who have challenges with the connectivity at home can go to school and they can teach from there. My question is education for the teachers or is it aimed at the students? Nothing is said about provision for students who have challenges with connectivity. The Secretary is quite clear in his mind that there are challenges with both devices and connectivity. As a matter of fact, he tried to illustrate the little challenges that places like Speyside, Roxborough, Scarborough, Palativere, Lansome would have, painting a picture of almost perfection. And if there is a picture of almost perfection, we need to ask ourselves in this honorable house, why the wide call? Why the begging? Why do you want this house to ask businesses, civil society organizations, private citizens, even private citizens, to give devices for school again? I must say for school, for use in school. It would have made a hell of a difference if my friend, my colleague, the Secretary said homeschooling. It would have given context to the school, but he just said for school. I'm not going to put ideas in his mind, nor am I going to try to elucidate his speech, but I deal it as it comes. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, it is moments like these that says to me, the presiding officer had a right to resign. It's just too much confusion for any presiding officer to preside over. If I had been a presiding officer under these trying circumstances, I too would have thrown in the sponge. It doesn't make sense to come here and deal with 6 of one, half a dozen of the next. Semantics that does not add up. Allow me to paint a picture of our region. And I'll pull 2 areas of our region from which I believe we can learn something or two. Because while we are looking at the region, we are looking at Grenada and we are looking at the back end of things. We need to look at it holistically. I would have expected from my good friend, the Secretary for Education, a more detailed approach. Himself being a teacher, himself being one of the senior members of this house, I expected more details. I expected something that would have taken all of us on a course of learning and to convince us at the end that these are the resources that are needed. With a certain level of precision, with a certain level of specificity. It was vague and somewhat opaque. In Barbados, for example, in Barbados, they have numbered the students and they basically focus on primary and secondary, even though some mention is made of the childhood education. They have numbered the schools and the teachers. I only got from my learned friend here that 700 out of 846 teachers have been prepared for online training. We did not know what type of a rigorous program they would have gone through, how many days, and against what they are rated. We are just told they have been prepared for online training. Again, it lacked details, it lacked specificity, vague, opaque, a crying shame on our institution. Here we're supposed to be leading Tobago. Here we ought to be guiding and preparing Tobago for autonomy. But we are coming like blind people, grappling into darkness, hoping that we stand up. There are over 45,623 students in Barbados. And Barbados will say to you that they require devices for 6,500 students. That's the devices they need. At least they are saying something. Whether those figures are true or not, they're speaking globally. How many students there are in Tobago right now? And what is the figure? What does the figure reflect? What does it capture? Childhood education? Are they into online learning too? Or are they just running around watching Sesame Street, SpongeBob and Patrick? What are they engaging childhood education? No one's spoken of that here. Primary school, is it all students A, B, C, right up to standard 5? How many students there are in the whole of Tobago? Don't try to segmentize the thing and show us where you feel there is light. Whether it's 100% or 84% or 94%. We want to look at the thing holistically. This is the Tobago House of Assembly. And we must have respect for each other's time and the learning of each person who comes in here. We expected that. How many students? But not only did Barbados inform us, and it's an IDB report, I'll point it to him that he could do some reading on that when he has time. It shows that there are 45,623 students in Barbados. It does not include university students. Primary, there are about 25,039 students, both public and private. That's primary level. Secondary level, there are 20,584 students, private and public. And teachers, there are over 3,425 teachers, both private and public, including preschools. They have numbered the schools in Barbados. 101 primary schools. The way he spoke, he mentioned 5 schools, and he gave the impression that everything is hunky-dory in Tobago because we're real good here. That's not enough for the man who is managing education on behalf of 60,000 persons. It's not enough. It's flawed. Misrepresentation of the facts. Manipulation of data to give the impression that all is well in Israel. I wish to say to you, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, that Barbados only have 29 secondary schools. and 24 childhood / nursery schools. They know what they need. 6,500 devices they said they need. Education says that. And that's laptops, iPads, whatever platforms they have, learning devices. But when coming to internet, it's another thing. They recognize that they have need for 500 internet connectivity devices. They know that. At least they say so. How many more devices do we need in Tobago? How many more? Is it 10, 5, 100? How many more? I'm ashamed this morning of my good friend. He had a great opportunity to operate as a surgeon with precision, to be prepared. So when we beg, we don't bad beg. Because this is what it is. This is institutionalizing begging. Where did they do with the 50 million COVID grant? No one seems to know. The beneficiaries of that money can't be found. At least, not those with school children. Let's go to Jamaica. Let's go to Jamaica. Bigger country, more complex place. In Jamaica, they have details also, compared to Tobago. We could talk Trinidad and Tobago, but let's talk Tobago. They have a program they feature ever so often. Let's talk Tobago. But Tobago ain't saying nothing. In Jamaica, there's 162 primary schools, public and private, 162. In those 162 primary schools, you will find 9,560 teachers. They are big on education. And those 9,560 teachers, they are responsible for the lives of 236,160 students. You can imagine that? That's a hell of a thing, eh? That's what they're dealing with. In the high schools, there are 791 secondary schools. 12,700 teachers who are responsible for 214,000 students. So what they are doing, they have their own program as opposed to Barbados. They have a Google G Suite program that they're working with. What Jamaica government is doing, they have gotten some of the service providers, the Flow, the Digicel, etc. And they have provided free internet to certain websites. We're talking about 30 websites. You want to talk CXC? You want to talk different education websites? You can go there free. Free. They call it a zero-rated data plan. That's what they refer to. And yet for persons who are already on them, you could pay something and get a little extra benefit. But even if you don't have, whether you're a customer or not of Digicel in particular, whether you're a customer or not, you have access to these websites. What are we doing here? I did not hear what Digicel is doing for Tobago. I did not hear what the other cables are doing for Tobago. Flow is doing for Tobago, or Trico is doing for Tobago. I did not hear what TSTT is doing for Tobago. They have incorporated both TV and radio. Our local TV, Channels 5, is still grappling with connectivity to the masses. Only a few people benefit from Channels 5 or local TV. And our radio stations just is out of it. That's all I can say. They're out of it. Jamaica has that particular program. What do we have? Nothing. We have nothing. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, it's not enough to say 400 parents have been trained. It's not enough. It's not enough to even come here into this house and beg this house to beg employers to give parents a blight. This is the Tobago House of Assembly. And in this house, in accordance with Act number 40 of 1996, we ought to make assembly laws. And education falls under the Tobago House of Assembly. So does health services. In a particular act, I can't remember the act now, Tobago House of Assembly was made an employer by the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. So Tobago House of Assembly is an employer, just as Service Commission. When you are an employer, you have the right to say to the employed that if your child has online lessons and there's no one to supervise that child, you have time off to go. But again, they have not reached that state of self-actualization. They are still grappling with physiological needs. Where to sit down. I want a cushy-mushy office. I want a car to drive. That's what the assembly is now grappling with. Physiological needs. Not the point of self-actualization where they want to do the work just for the work's sake. I long to see a House of Assembly. Maybe it will be the next assembly, and I would to God they would announce the date today. That we would have the chance, the Progressive Democratic Patriots would have the chance to create an assembly that is driven by the dictates of our people, the need to serve. And when we serve, we will actually feel as if we are fulfilling our purpose. Because our purpose is not a fancy office, a big house, down lowlands, or a BM6 series. It's not that. It's about the people of Tobago. Bringing education, bringing health care, bringing COVID grants to them, ensuring they are safe. By the way, I heard there's another case in Tobago again today, COVID case. The year was 2010 when Trinidad and Tobago began a laptop program called E-Connect and Learn. That program...
Remember, you have 10 minutes of your original speaking time remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer. In 2010, this country began a laptop program called E-Connect and Learn. It was initiated by the government of that time. It is said between, and I'm speaking nationally, not this country as the island Tobago, but Trinidad and Tobago. It is said between 2010 and 2013 that the government would have issued over 54,000 laptops. 54,000 laptops. A report, and that's carried, that was said by Dr. Swelden Ryan in one of his columns, August 18, 2015. He said that between 2010 and 2013, the government issued 54,329 laptops. The question is, how much laptops did the Tobago House of Assembly under the Ministry of Education distribute? How many laptops? I read somewhere where Royal Bank issued some $1 million for some 300 laptops. But is it 300 enough? How many students do we have in both primary and secondary schools? How many laptops did the Division of Education issue to Tobago people? And what were the criteria for the issuing of these laptops? Because we are hearing through the grapevine that if you belong to a particular organization, you're getting laptop easy. As a matter of fact, we have heard you're getting more than laptops. You're getting money to buy fridge, money to buy stove. And you're getting about 50,000 to repair a roof. But what about laptops? What about laptops? This is a crisis where those who are responsible for the next generation are now engaged in e-learning, online learning. We must ask a question to this house. How many laptops were distributed? We want to find out how many parents are living in homes without electricity. How many homes are without electricity? We want to find out the data so we can speak to TNTech and under the self-help program have those homes wired. That should be the conversation. We also want to find out who are we catering for with laptops? Is it from ABC, preschool, to secondary, to university? These are important questions. The Prime Minister, in responding to the laptop program in the Parliament, stated that there is no statistically significant impact. It has no statistically significant impact on the students' performance. He was responding to a report that was done regarding the eConnect and Learn program. He also questioned the relatively high dissatisfaction with the provision of the internet service. I have had to buy some mobile devices and distribute to people within my community. Not only did I have to buy those devices, I have to pay the bill also. It's a 2-year contract with B-Mobile. Did the Ministry of the Division of Education think about that? At least having these parents bring their children to school and have some social distancing so they could sit down and benefit from the Wi-Fi that is being there and used by no one now but gargoyles and zombies. As I close on this, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, I wish to say that we do not support this bill in its current form or this motion in its current form. We would seek to amend this. All right? And I'm timing myself at the end of the day. How much more time do I have currently? 1 minute?
Actually, you have 4 minutes remaining.
Lovely, thank you. I will try to do that for minutes. Thank you much, sir. We will want to say that we should not call upon employers, managers, and supervisors, both public and private sector, to have a sense of tolerance. We shouldn't do that. We should move a bill, an assembly bill, and send it to Trinidad and ensure that parents and students would be able to create that relationship at home that is desirable for learning. as the president of the PSA, I wish to say I did speak to the Minister of Finance, and currently now we have before the Minister of Finance a document that would allow public officers to stay at home with their children and get pay if they so desire under the new COVID guidelines. We have put that there. It will be taken to Parliament, to Cabinet, to be authorized or sanctioned. I've done my part as a trade unionist to protect the working class. We need to do our part in this House of Assembly. I thank you, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer. I hope that my time here was spent asking the right questions on behalf of Tobago and perhaps pointing in the direction that we need to go with this begging bill. Thank you. Or begging motion.
Member for Plymouth Golden Lane and Assistant Secretary in the Division of Education, Innovation and Energy, Assemblyman Marshall Osman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer. And I too would like to join in wishing the members of this House, and of course Tobago by extension, belated Republic Day on behalf of the electoral district of Plymouth Golden Lane, and of course on my own behalf. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals were adopted by all member states in 2015. These Sustainable Development Goals are considered the blueprint to a better life for all, and the leaders from each member state agreed to invest in programs and resources in their respective countries to try and bring an end to poverty, protect their spaces, and ensure that all humans enjoy a good life by 2030. Improvements in education systems and access to quality education by children, women, men, and young adults of these states are of great importance and registered as number 4 among the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. As an appendix to each Sustainable Development Goal, targets were outlined as benchmarks. Satisfying each target draws a country closer to the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals. To arrive at goal number 4, some of the targets included that leaders in their respective countries are to ensure that all girls and boys complete free, equitable, and quality primary and secondary education, leading to relevant and effective learning outcomes. That by 2030, all girls and boys should have access to quality early childhood development, care, and pre-primary education so that they are ready for primary education. By 2030, the hope is that there is equal access for all women and men to affordable and quality technical, vocational, and tertiary education, including university. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, Trinidad and Tobago, as a member state, adopted these principles and made several moves over the years to satisfy Sustainable Development Goal number 4. At the level of the Ministry of Education and the Tobago House of Assembly, several measures were undertaken, such as the presentation of the Ministries of Education's Draft Education Policy Paper 2017 to 2022, which outlines the policy direction of the Ministry of Education with respect to early childhood, primary, secondary, special education, tertiary, and technical vocational studies. There has been efforts to improve and maintain the infrastructure at the early childhood level, primary and secondary schools through the annual school repair program. Over the years, we have commissioned new school buildings with modern designs, modern rooms, and of course, technology. There has been a deliberate focus on training of educators in early childhood care, primary to secondary. Great attention has been given to technical vocational education training as our youth and young adults are encouraged to enroll in courses at YTEP, MIC, NESC, Hospitality and Tourism Institutes, and of course the Construction Certificate Program introduced by the Division of Education, Innovation, and Energy. There was introduction of the GATE program, restructuring of the curriculum at all levels, early childhood, primary, and secondary. A lot of time, effort, resources, and planning has been undertaken over the years in an effort to meet and satisfy Vision 2030. It is 2020, a few years away from the mandate set in 2015, and COVID-19 is here. And the experts in health are stating that this pandemic may span 2 to 3 years. Education systems all over the world have been impacted by this pandemic. Its presence creates feelings of uncertainty, makes one very uneasy, and many questions now arise about the future of the education system during and post this pandemic. Ministers and leaders in education must now rethink their approaches to curriculum delivery, as this pandemic has brought to a halt the traditional modes of teaching and learning. The United Nations policy brief entitled Education During COVID and Beyond states vividly that the COVID-19 pandemic has created the largest disruption of education systems in history, affecting nearly 1.6 billion learners in more than 190 countries and all continents. Closure of schools and other learning spaces have impacted 94% of the world student population. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, since March, schools in this country have been physically shut and have remained so to date. This COVID-19 situation makes it close to impossible to have physical teacher-pupil contact time. This lack has impacted significantly on the teaching process at all levels and has forced us to resort to online teaching and learning. This approach has been adopted by many countries. In my research, I counted over 70 countries that are now exposing their students to online learning. This pandemic has called on all of us as educators, parents, and citizens to reach into our creative and innovative self to create ways to reach our students and children. As it stands, only online teaching is possible at this time in Trinidad and Tobago, and that is accepted. The Minister of Education has indicated that 65,000 students are without devices, and in these cases, where access to online is not possible, packages are to be prepared. Since the start of the new term, there has been many frustrations from principals and children and parents alike. But Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, this motion begs of us to recognize and accept the new normal of online teaching and learning, to highlight and support the initiatives of the Division of Education, Innovation, and Energy, to cooperate, support, demonstrate patience and tolerance in this new normal, to call upon corporate Trinidad and Tobago, any good Samaritan, to assist with the provision of appropriate devices. Since the onset of this pandemic and to date, the management and staff at the Division of Education, Innovation and Energy have worked to put measures in place to assist our teachers, parents, and students. As a division, we have risen to face this challenge. I must commend the manager and staff at the Student Support Unit, our school supervisors 1, 2, and 3, the managers of our Early Childhood Unit, our administrator, our advisor at the division, every other member of staff at our division, principals, teachers, parents, and all our stakeholders. Your contributions, large or small, have been very helpful. Today, my presentation would focus on the initiatives of 3 units at the Division of Education, Innovation and Energy: the Student Support Services Unit, Early Childhood Care and Education Unit, and Special Education. I will share the initiatives that were implemented during the closure of school in March and on the reopening of school in September. Student Support Services. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, when the students went home in March, the staff of our Student Support Unit maintained contact and checked in with students who were referred before the dismissal. They used the division's website to reach out when the nation on a whole went into full lockdown, by providing a platform for parents and or students to ask questions, by posting coping tips and videos to address issues of anxiety and depression, and by converting the referral form into an e-form and making it accessible to parents. In collaboration with the Division of Finance and Economy, they were able to provide assistance to needy students during the lockdown period when parents weren't able to go out to work. The annual assistance to necessitous students continued during the July-August vacation, and students were given essential and much-needed back-to-school items. As school reopened, they were part of the orientation sessions, both at primary and secondary levels. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, I move on to early childhood care and education. The current COVID-19 pandemic and the closure of physical school has impacted the traditional mode of delivery of the curriculum to our preschoolers. Prior to the reopening in September, the staff at the early childhood care centers were involved in 4 weeks of intense one-day training workshops, learning about Zoom, Google Classroom, and learning to create and upload videos. They were also engaged in data collection to ascertain the number of preschoolers who had access to usable devices. There was also internet connectivity at our early childhood centers, and of course, installation of the sinks, dispensers, all of that in preparation for if the plant would open. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, on the reopening of school, to date, the 12 of our early childhood centers, those that are under our purview, reflect as such. Speyside Early Childhood Center has an enrollment of 47 students. All of them are using devices, none are collecting packages. Mariah Early Childhood Center, 30 students, 8 are using devices, 22 are collecting packages. Castara Early Childhood Center, 30 on enrollment, 28 are using devices, 2 students are collecting packages. Mount St. George Early Childhood Center, enrollment 51 students, 29 on devices, 22 are collecting packages. Bell Garden Early Childhood Center, 38 on enrollment, all 38 are using devices. Little Angels, 1 on enrollment, 1 device in use. Mount Pleasant Early Childhood Center, 65 on enrollment, all 65 are on devices. Signal Hill Early Childhood Center, 45 on enrollment, 21 devices in use, 24 packages are being collected. Mount Grace Early Childhood Center, 52 on enrollment, 18 devices used, 34 packages are collected. Booker Early Childhood Center, 49 on enrollment, 24 devices are in use, and 25 are collecting packages. Plymouth Bethesda Early Childhood Center, 36 are on enrollment, 23 are using devices, and 13 are collecting packages. The preschoolers are exposed to a full week of online teaching. I met a parent recently, and she was sharing with me how her daughter is enjoying the online experience. And I know that there are many parents that share that sentiment. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, I move now to special education, and I draw my focus to Happy Haven. Prior to reopening, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, the students were engaged through WhatsApp by the teachers of that institution. There was also data collection to determine the number of children that require devices, and of course, the Division of Education put in the necessary infrastructure in anticipation of the reopening of school in September. When school reopened in September online, at that school, there's an enrollment of 28 children, students. All students and teachers have devices at that institution, and those devices were donated by the Digicel Foundation. They also were in receipt of tablet cases, which were donated by another corporate sponsor. In that school, they have also devised a method called a Dropbox system, where the parents can drop off the assignments of their boys and girls after they are completed. And of course, because it is a special need institution, what the teachers have engaged to do is to roster the teaching and learning time, because each student there would require something special and something different. I move now to the School for the Deaf, Speech and Language Impaired. Prior to school reopening, the PTA reached out to families to offer assistance in some form or the other. The teachers at that institution were engaged the children on Google Classroom, and of course, they collected the same data to indicate how many children were in need of devices. On the reopening of school in September, the school enrollment at that institution is 30 pupils. 23 of them are accessing teaching and learning through devices, and 7 are collecting packages. The corporate sponsor, Digicel Foundation, has donated the devices, as mentioned before, and they have also made provision for the purchasing of masks, shields, sanitizers, and all those things that the children would need to feel safe once we get back into the compound. Angostura Limited was also kind to this institution, and they have provided stationery material to staff and students for use. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, we are almost at the end of September, and the students have been engaged in some form through devices or by packages. To have an idea of the progress, I called a few principals and teachers, spoke to parents and even some children. The significant challenge, as we all accept or know, is the lack of devices for the children. The principals to whom I have spoken commend their teachers highly for the efforts they are making, and the parents are saying just the same. As a parent, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, I am experiencing and adjusting to this new normal of online teaching and learning, and I empathize with every single parent. The turbulences that we are experiencing are expected, because we are dealing with a situation for which there was no plan. What is required at this time is all hands on deck. Parents, educators, business sector, children, every citizen is needed to assist in the resolution. The direction has not shifted, and focus toward reaching our target by 2030 should remain the same. We are speculating based on past as to the duration of this pandemic. Looking ahead, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, we may have to consider at some point in the Division of Education a COVID response unit or a COVID coordinator with the sole responsibility to study, collect data, coordinate, and enhance the measures that have been undertaken at the division. This unit or coordinator can build handsomely on what these two special purpose committees have done. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, the division is ready and we are doing our part. Permit me at this time to congratulate all our students who were successful in the CSEC and CAPE examination of 2020. Amid trying circumstances, they prevailed. The Secretary of Education outlined in detail the steps taken thus far, and thanks to his leadership and vision. Support and need for devices is necessary, and Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, I support the motion as tabled, and I look forward to a favorable response. Thank you.
Dr. Faith B. Israel, Minority Council.
Good morning, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer. Good morning to the members of the Assembly, and a special good morning to those who are viewing this sitting after a break via the various media now. Let me join the others in wishing this nation a belated Republic Day. Happy Republic Day, as we now have to deal with the new normal of not having the celebrations that we normally do, and particularly since those of us in the East enjoyed the Republic Day celebrations that have been happening over the last couple years. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, it seems like I will join my political leader and minority leader of the Tobago House of Assembly in identifying the fact that this PNM-led Executive Council seems to insist on bringing motions and seems to make presentations of those motions that do not bring real substance to the people of Tobago. We started at the beginning of the term with similar motions, and it seems like we are going to round out this term doing the same thing. So sure, let's keep playing with people's lives. So yes, we are forced to have online learning. So let us ask workplaces to accommodate that. Let us ask businesses and communities to assist as much as they can, even though we are all aware of the fact that COVID-19 has drastically reduced the economic standing of Trinidad and Tobago. And even though we know that many businesses and organizations, particularly in Tobago, before COVID-19 came about, were already struggling economically. So to now ask them, after having reduced economic activity for the last couple months, to be a part of this process is also putting strain on them. And sure, let us completely ignore our responsibilities as the THA to do what we are tasked to do what we have been elected and selected to do. And on top of all of that, let us continue coming to this house boasting about the fact that we are doing better than some, and particularly doing better than Trinidad. But the thing about the term better is that it is relative. If you have a 50% pass, sure, that is better than somebody with a 45% pass, but 50% in many instances is still a fail. So the fact that we have done better, or we are boasting about doing better, gives me absolutely no comfort when the quote-unquote better that we are doing is not good enough. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, I will highlight 3 specific issues that I think are critical for us as we go forward. The first is really an assessment on whether the division with responsibility for education really has been providing the support to the teachers, to the students, and to the parents as they claim to be providing today. I would also like to look at our child protection mechanisms, considering where we are now and what is happening. And I would also like to specifically focus on some of the issues that parents have identified and how we can help with those issues. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, the WHO declared COVID-19 as a global pandemic in March 2020. The Director General at that time warned us about how badly it could be. Granted, of course, I would admit, we would all admit, that at that time we had not fully understood the magnitude of what was happening, and therefore using March as a benchmark may actually be a little bit unfair in terms of identifying how prepared we need to be. But that was 6 months ago, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer. Since then, we have seen in many instances daily, weekly reports about how bad this disease has been, about how many people have gotten sick, about how many people have died, and coincidentally, I understand that Tobago had to suffer a second COVID-19 official death within recent times. Condolences to the friends and family of that person, of both people. I am not convinced, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, though, that the kind of preparedness that we claim to have had or we claim to have made is really what is being experienced on the ground, particularly when you speak with teachers, parents, and some of the students. So, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, I would ask that the division with responsibility for education be the first in doing what it is asking other employers to do, which is to demonstrate tolerance, understanding, and commitment to those they employ. Because in many instances, we, and by we I mean the Tobago House of Assembly, have not done that. So it is hypocritical for us to sit here, to stand here, and ask other businesses to do what we have failed to do. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, the Sunday before school was about to start, I have actually had several teachers reach out to me asking for additional assistance with learning about the various platforms, whether it's Zoom, Teams, whatever it is, because they felt like they were being tossed into a situation that they were not prepared for. In many instances, they said that yes, after that first week of training, you can now boast, as in the division, can now boast that you have trained so many teachers. But if you really, really, really were to ask the teachers how they feel about the training, they would tell you that they are overwhelmed. They would tell you that they do not feel like they have the technical capacity to do what is required. And I would strongly suggest, and I would strongly endorse, as a matter of fact, the recommendation that was just presented by the Assistant Secretary to really have a COVID-19 coordinator, or whatever you want to call the position, to have someone critically review what has happened and to determine whether what you expect the outcomes to be were really the outcomes. Our teachers need to be well trained to ensure that they can provide the teaching that our children need. We need to ensure, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, that the division has IT specialists who are waiting and ready at beck and call, so that when these teachers come across technical difficulties, they know that there is a number or several numbers, or they know the specific person that they can call and say, hey, I'm in the middle of class, this is what's going on, I need help now. Now, this is not going to be something that we need forever and ever and ever. But given that this is something new, it is something that we need right now, and it should have been put in place then. We need to ensure that the teachers, the principals, they all know that when they call this particular number, they would get real help. And you know how I know they need real help? Because many of them have actually been reaching out to me asking for the help. So they need it. I am happy that in some instances, the schools are available so that the teachers can go there and for that to be the base for their teaching. But as the minority leader identified, we need to also ensure that we do not only provide that service for the teachers, because even if the teachers have access to relatively decent connectivity, the teachers are not teaching themselves. And it is the thousands of students that need to have that kind of access. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, we also need to ensure that our classes do not end every 40 minutes, because this free Zoom that many of the teachers are using ends every 40 minutes. So that means they have to cut and start over. Now, for some of the younger students, that might be fine. But for some of the older students, they may be smack in the middle of something important. And because the teachers are using the free Zoom, they are forced to cut off. And then, for those who may want to have a paid account, they are then asked for their personal credit cards to ensure that that service is available. that is something that we at the Tobago House of Assembly could have ensured was not happening a month into this online learning. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, we spoke a couple weeks ago about the fact that a $7.8 million project was being executed to provide devices for schools or for children or for teachers who need those devices. We are now several weeks into school, and I was hoping that the Secretary with responsibility for education and the Assistant Secretary or the Assistant Secretary with responsibility for education would have given very clear instructions about the process for accessing those devices. Because as you so outlined, though you speak about the number of people who have gotten online, you also speak about the fact that many of our teachers and our students do not actually own their own devices. And they have been reaching out asking what is the process to get those devices. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, what we've been seeing, instead of that being laid out clearly, and I was hoping that it would be on, the Facebook pages and the websites and so forth, so that I could direct, when people message and ask, I could direct them there. And because it was not there, I was really, really, really hoping that that information would have been provided today. There is still time in the roundup for you to let us know, to let the people of Tobago know how they can access those devices. What is the process? Do they have to speak to the principal? Is the principal the one who needs to recommend who needs the devices? How is this going to work? It is funny because I see all over the place politicians donating devices and taking out pictures and making a big hoopla about it for their own political gains, when in fact we should not be in this position right now, a month into online learning for a pandemic that started in March. And it is ironic that we are praising many of the teachers and principals and those others who have been doing donations and other fundraising activities. We praise them now. However, it is sad to say that that praise was not always there. And in many instances, those same principals and teachers and parents and so forth who were busy doing fundraising to ensure that their students got devices were actually reprimanded and were threatened because they were putting the school and they were putting the division in a bad light. So you come today and you speak about praising those, when in fact, those principals, teachers, and parents were threatened when they were doing it. It's a sad day, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer. We speak about the fact that packages are being given. I am interested in understanding, though, given that the Ministry of Education sent out that letter, was it this week or last week, about the fact that we are not supposed to be photocopying books and all of those. I would like to know then what is in those packages that we are asking the teachers to provide to the students who do not have devices. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, I'm not going to be long. Let me move on to the second and probably the more important part of this presentation. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, we are in a situation now where our children are at home, and it is a well-known fact. Anyone who has studied child development, who studied child social work, knows that many of the cases of child abuse that is experienced happens either at home or at the home of the person who is abusing the child. Which means we now have a situation, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, where we are leaving children who are at risk of being abused at home with their abusers. And this is a situation that we need to pay very, very close attention to. And it is a situation where we need to plan for, and we need to have very clear, practical steps on how we are going to treat with it. We also know, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, that these last couple months have been very, 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 very difficult for most people. Practically everyone, they've been difficult. We've had social issues, emotional issues, financial issues, and other constraints as a result of COVID-19. And when you look at the literature, all of these are factors that significantly increase the risk of child abuse. Therefore, we have a situation that has a potential to be really, really bad if we do not take critical steps. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, I am suggesting that the division with responsibility for education partners very closely with the division with responsibility for social services, with the police, and with Children's Authority to ensure that a robust monitoring system be implemented right now. If this is already happening, I will be elated to understand it, to hear about it, and to congratulate those who are doing it. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, what this monitoring process should entail.
You have 10 minutes of speak time remaining.
No problem, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer. What this monitoring process should entail includes statutory or periodic wellness checkups to be a part of the standard operating procedure for whether it's guidance counselors, social workers, or whoever we identify, to ensure that we continually are in contact with our island's children. It may mean having home visits every now and then and seeing what's going on. In addition to that, now that may mean having to hire a couple people to ensure that we have the staff to do this. But in critical times like these, we need to take critical measures. We also need, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, to have very clear algorithms about what needs to happen when we have identified, and by we I mean either the guidance counselor, the social worker, the teacher, whoever it is, may have identified that there is a child that is in need of care and protection. What do they do? Now, what the teacher or the social worker or the guidance counselor does when the child is coming to school may not necessarily be applicable now that the child is at home. So we need to critically walk through the steps that need to be taken when we identify these situations. Because fortunately or unfortunately, they will arise. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, we need to also ensure that everyone understands what their role is in these circumstances. We cannot afford a situation where people believe that it is not their responsibility or they do not know what to do if and when a situation like this arises. Let me quickly jump to the third issue, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer. And this is something that has come up several times because we have now a situation where we have students at home learning, a situation where this is new for the students, a situation where this requires significant supervision of these students. But for many of these students, the person who is supposed to be supervising them is an essential worker who needs to be at work, whatever that work may be, whether it's a doctor, a nurse, whether it is a teacher. Have we thought about what happens when teachers are supposed to be teaching, but their children are supposed to be learning and need supervision? How does that work? We need to think through critically how we ensure that we take care of all of our children and we do not put those children who are children of people who provide essential services at risk of neglect or at risk of being abused. So we need to ensure, for example, that maybe all teaching does not necessarily happen at 10 o'clock in the morning. Or we need to ensure that if there are children of essential workers, that we make some kind of provision for them. These are issues that need to be critically looked at, and these are issues that we need to have answers for. The fact is, it is the 25th of September. We are 6 months into the declaration of this pandemic. We know it is going to be like this for some time. We knew it was going to be like this for some time. And the Tobago House of Assembly had a very good opportunity to show that it could make a passing grade, not just a better than our brother or sister grade, but an actual passing grade as it related to our island's children. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, I am asking all of us to take our responsibility seriously, to not just do bare minimum, to not just pat ourselves on the back or on the shoulder to say we are doing this and to give such a rosy picture of what's happening. But let us really, really, really look at what is happening on the ground. Let us see how it is being experienced, and let us put systems in place to mitigate the negative impacts before they happen. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, I thank you.
Thank you. Honorable members, this sitting will now be suspended for 1 hour and will resume at 1:15 p.m.